one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Good evening, and welcome to the Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster, Dan Williamson, and I'm your host, John Bona. Good evening, guys.
Good evening, John.
Good evening, John, from California.
Hey, Marshall, how you doing? Good to hear your voice again.
Oh, yes. Wonderful day.
You know, we're going to talk about this evening and probably several programs ahead, the principles of a Christian economy, and we'd like to explain that as best we can in our discussion. And, you know, I think just talking to people out there that there's probably few situations more interesting to people in America this day than the economy this very day. And, you know, the good news is America is still the most prosperous and greatest nation on the planet. But much work needs to be done to keep her as a thriving economic nation. And I think one thing we should remember is that people made America what it is today, and Christians can make America what it ought to be. I think Christians believe that. And, you know, what is, of course, the economic liberty, that question, the principles of Christian economics? You know, since economics in general is like the science that deals with production, distribution, consumption of goods and services in our economy, a Christian economy is, I would say, the discipline that studies the application of those things, of distribution, consumption of goods and services. In other words, how men should use God-given natural resources, for example, the ideas that we get to be creative, and then the energy that God gives us to meet human needs, and of course, as a Christian, to glorify Christ in our work. And, you know, what I've learned, Marshall, is that really a Christian economy will really flow from the heart of man. And the heart of man, and I think part of what we'll talk about tonight is how important that is. Because as we know, in fact, we're doing a film with Dr. Foster and Kurt Cameron called Monumental that will be released in February of 2012. And this film, a good part of this message has to do with Christianity producing internal liberty in man, which really is a foundation for a Christian economy as well. And, of course, this internal change in the heart that Christ could only bring, he's the only one that could bring that, it produces Christian character and what we call self-government. And those things produce wonderful things. In other words, when you have those Christian characters, you don't steal. You know, billions of dollars are lost every year by American business to theft by their employees. Those are just facts. And, you know, also this Christian character will produce a strong work ethic. And people will want to be productive. They'll want to see the economy grow. People will just save more, invest, and they'll have concern for their family, their posterity, to pass it on. Now, Marshall, I know you've been, you know, the World History Institute for 30 years, teaching these principles, the truth of the gospel, and how it imparts these ideas for man to be creative, and that bring internal liberty to man. And you've been going around the country and really the world introducing this concept of Christianity, a Christian economy, and how that manifests itself even to externally to political freedom. And Marshall, again, thank you for joining us. I know you're very busy out there making and editing that film right now. And how you doing?
No problem. Doing great, John. It's great to take time out and do this because it's so important for our nation. And, the hundreds of thousands who will be listening in with us, they can be learning along with us in this very important topic. I can't think of a topic more important right now to the families of America than how are they going to be prosperous in the future in light of the fact that we as a nation have got ourselves into 120 or 130 trillion dollars in unfunded liabilities that we can never pay back. We seem like we're at a standstill, if not going completely backwards. And what hope is there? And that's what I think that our program is dedicated to, is to really show the story of liberty, and in this case, the story of liberty economically. How can we restore that liberty and make America once again a city on a hill, a place, an example where everybody wants to come? I was in England just a couple of years ago on a tour, and I'll never forget going in the gym in a hotel, and this entrepreneur came up to me and he said, "Can you get me a visa? Is there anything you can do to get me over to America?" And of course, if you come from England, you can't get a visa. You can just walk across the border now in the South, but if you try to get a visa from England, it's almost impossible. He said, "I want to bring my business over." He says, "Over in England, we can't do anything. It's complete control. There's like 60% tax rate. I can't build on my own property." And so he said there is practically no entrepreneurship, and England is living off the tourist trade from America, basically. And I said how sad that was, and I was looking back a couple of years ago, and now looking at America, we're going that same direction. But the good news is that there's an answer, and the answer is so clear in history, and it's so clear in the Bible, that if we simply will live by the laws of the universe, the laws that God structured from the very beginning of time, and he gave to Moses in the Ten Commandments, and he gave to the Jews when they set up the Hebrew Republic. And it was local self-government. It was family control of private property. It was, like you said, John, don't steal from your neighbor, and don't kill somebody else, and don't lust after his property. These are just basic principles, 6 of which come out of the Ten Commandments, which are the foundation for free enterprise. And they made the Jews, in a period of a few hundred years, the wealthiest nation in the world, and yet they were a small band of people that came out of nowhere compared to Egypt and Babylon and all these countries around them. But they became so successful that, as we know, Solomon was the richest man in the world. How could it be that they could go from nothing to that? Well, I believe it's very clear from history that not only did the Jews experience it, but every nation that has followed these biblical principles, especially in the Christian era, from the time of Patrick of Ireland and the conversion of Ireland through England, Scotland, Holland, and America, and many other peoples that have obeyed these biblical principles of honesty, integrity, and obedience to God's commandments, and not having false weights and measures, and having a gold standard as a base for your currency so that the government cannot cheat. And all of these things that are laid out in Scripture, those that have obeyed these principles have seen tremendous economic success. And those nations that don't obey those principles don't see that success. In the 11th century, there was a man who invented ironworks in a tremendous, expansive way. He had hundreds and thousands of employees, and he was the first entrepreneur to take and create iron from this molten rock and create this tremendous, powerful force of iron. The problem is that the emperor heard of this about a year later, and he came in with his armies and killed the man, took his business, and, of course, destroyed it because it became government-owned. That's an example of what happens in terms of businesses throughout the world when you don't have a biblically based foundation and you don't have a biblically based government. It's very hard to set up a McDonald's on a corner when Genghis Khan could come by the next morning, kill all your employees, take all the money out of your cash drawer, and shut down your business. And that's what happens when you don't have Christianity as a foundation for civilization.
That would be tough to sell a burger.
Marshall, that we see today is an interesting dichotomy going on. And this will challenge a few people at first, but I think they'll catch on quickly. We talk about tax cuts, but tax cuts simply mean a tax burden deferred, because we haven't dealt with the core principle, and that is government should be small. As long as government is large and has a massive budget, we can cut taxes all day long, and all we're really doing is deferring the liability to future generations. That's an unbiblical approach. We should have small government, strong families. When the Federal Reserve prints money, all they do is create inflation, or more importantly, create debt notes that are obligations to pay for future generations. So every time we raise the debt ceiling, we place burdens on families generationally into the future that they may never be able to pay back. And so when people talk about a tax cut, if there aren't the accompanying cuts in government, meaning the principle that government is small and in essence family is large, and this right take us back to there's two kinds of businesses being built. Businesses where it's all about me, how do I make my million and exit my business to go golfing, or how do I build my business and then I expand my business to bring the family members in as they come along, children, grandchildren, etc., and then I bless other people because I need other workers to work in my business, and it expands and expands. Not what's my exit strategy, it's how is my building strategy. And that's that whole Christian work ethic that I work 6, rest 1, which we're commanded because we would work 7 if we were allowed to, because all our work is to glorify God, to bless the future generations that they might glorify God, and yet we have a whole culture that's focused on growing the government bigger and bigger to take care of us rather than go at the core level, which is the family, build strong biblical economics, like you were saying, productivity, lots of children, limited debt, have the home be the center of that economic strength instead of the government. So even that debate of cutting taxes, I mean, we all love cutting taxes, but if cutting taxes is just deferring the payment, then we've just cursed the future generations. And God says, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. When the righteous rule, the people will rejoice. So Christians have to take a hard look at how we see things. Tax cuts that are just good for me today are not really a tax cut. That is just a deferred curse on future generations. And so we have to think in terms of biblical government, which is small, centralized government, strong family units, where they are building productivity and a work ethic on an everyday basis, expanding their businesses, not looking for exit strategies to get out, but rather to expand those businesses, not only to bless all their children and their future generations, but neighbors and friends that need jobs and work. And, of course, I work in a company that thinks that way, and I really I'm excited to be there because I think that's the right worldview.
I think that's the way to look at it, Dan. It's very interesting the way you put that, and on the other side of that, every time there's a tax increase, whatever it is, a little more freedom, a little more liberty, another small portion of everyone's life that has to pay that tax has been taken away by the government.
Absolutely.
And in addition, and it's not just America, I mean, governments all over the world are notorious for waste and inefficiency. And, even if a government promises to give $100 in benefits for the $100 in increased taxes, we all know that a good share of that $100, maybe $50 or $60 of it, it's going to pay some numerous government overhead, employees who don't have to compete in the free market or whatever, buildings, that government overhead. So the society in general never gets back that same amount of value that it would have had it been free, had the liberty to spend that $100 for themselves. And boy, I have just become a real believer in lower taxes. I think most of Americans have. I don't know anybody who wants higher taxes. I mean, the thing that's so obvious to me, too, is that as a business person, I see it. When taxes are lowered, it encourages business to invest and grow. It's just a natural outcome of it. It provides more jobs, lower prices, basically, which are beneficial for the consumer, right? And that causes the economy to grow. And then businesses and individual workers earn higher incomes. It's this whole train of events that follows. And, as the Reagan administration definitely proved beyond a shadow of a doubt, that these incomes that were taxed, even though they were taxed at a lower rate, more money still flowed into the government coffers because people were paying taxes on so much more income. Anyway, that whole tax discussion, we could talk about that for weeks.
Well, the Bible makes it clear that anything over a 10% tax, which should be a poll tax anyway, it should not be an income tax. Income tax is an unbiblical tax, and it's especially a graduated income tax. Absolutely unbiblical because it's not just weights and measures. You can't charge one person a higher rate and another person a lower rate and say you're just. You're not just. You are becoming the god of the society, determining who will pay what, which means you have a king. Let's call it what it is, and that's what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 8 when Samuel said that the people want a king to be over them, and God said, okay, if they want a king, he's going to take a tenth of their sheep and a tenth of their cows. He's going to take just the very fact that God said that the first thing the king's going to do is he's going to take a tenth. He's going to take my tithe, and he's going to take it from your skin. Instead of tithing, now you're going to give to the government 10, 20, 30. And pretty soon it says you will run your men in front of his chariots in international wars, and he'll put your wives to work in his soup kitchen. And that's what's happening today. It takes two incomes now to afford a house, and the wife can't stay home and raise the children, and people are completely pressured all the time with this huge tax rate. They can't get ahead, and it's totally unbiblical. And what has become God is not God who demands a tithe, 10%, but the God of our day is the government that demands 50 to 60% of the productivity of the people. And what that does is it simply is a reflection of the truth that you don't break God's law breaks you. I give you one illustration, John. You and I were talking about the movie Rollerball. It was about 20 years ago. Who was it? James Caan was the star of that movie.
Right.
And it was the movie about this. It was like roller derby, except this king or this power monger took over the society, and he decided that the masses would love to see death. And so he had this big metal roller ball that came down and knocked people down and killed them, and then people would just kill each other and hit each other with spikes, and the people kind of got into it. It was great. But then, someone rises up to try to overthrow it. But the point is that what happens when you don't have rules in economy, it's like having a roller game without rules. What happens is it becomes two Vikings with battle axes beating each other's brains out. And that's what's happening to our society. You are developing a hatred society where one class, one group, one individual hates another, and the object is to beat the other's brains out and get what you can from the government. That is what Thomas Jefferson said would happen as soon as we had a society with a high tax rate.
And what's remarkable about that is government never produces anything. Think about it. I had a person ask me that the other day, asked me a question, and I finally came back with this rhetorical question to him. I said, okay, I want you to invest in a senator. And short of bribery, you would never do it because there's no return. I said, invest in a tank. You would never invest in a tank. Do you know what it costs to maintain a tank? There's no return on that. I told him to invest in a bridge. Well, there's no return on that bridge unless you get to charge a toll at one end. The bottom line is our founding fathers understood there were many areas of government we would have to support. For instance, defense of the land to protect our property and our rights, some infrastructure projects for the general welfare of the people, and some government limited to maintain the laws. Because they all knew intuitively that no one in their right mind would invest in any of those things because they produce nothing. And that's why when government expanded beyond those limited constitutional limits, we've really allowed an unproductive aristocracy to grow that takes our money and kind of feeds itself. Here in Wisconsin, we just recently had a governor that had a whole series of battles with the employees, the government employees. And the big deal is they were going to lose all these union rights and all this stuff. But the real issue that he really got to was this, that they found out afterward that the insurance companies were all internal, that just one bidder provided the insurance for all these union employees. And they charged such a high rate that they would get all these profits. The profits were fed right back into the political system to maintain that wheel, that circle. And by removing that exclusivity and that bargaining right issue, they were able to bid out and get better prices. They saved $400 million, and a number of school districts, their budgets are balanced, and they're able to actually give some raises to the teachers. Well, this is what I mean by government. It's never productive. It's never a good investment because it feeds itself after a while. It's like a giant parasite that's hanging on this host, and it will feed on it, trying to keep that host alive as long as possible. And that's why government has to be kept very, very small and very limited. And that's what the founders tried to do. They knew intelligent people would never invest in government because it has no return. So they gave limited requirements, and they intended that's all we'd ever have. We've allowed government to grow to the point it's almost 50% of the economy. Now, that's a scary notion considering all GDP growth in the last 40 years has been debt-funded, which means if you take half the economy, which is government-driven, and then you start to ask yourself the question, well, what's left of the real economy if we stop printing debt notes? In other words, we don't raise the debt ceiling. It's a scary notion to know what's really left of the economy. We do know the private sector is pretty beat up right now, and the government sector would like to grow, and it produces nothing. And this is why we have to get it back to the family that is the core producer. And that's just got to be the focus, and it's got to start right at home.
Well, and that's it, Dan. Yeah, and that you talked about the two views. It's always been, right? The two views on one, that government should spend a lot of money to stimulate the economy, and our administration is doing it again. That Keynesian view, right?
That's right.
And then, the other strategy is the free market view. That really works. And we've seen that, and I'd like to talk about that in the second half of the show. We have a couple minutes left. By the way, if you'd like to contact us, you could reach us at thestoryofliberty.net with any questions or comments. But we could talk about that in the second half, how the free market, this wonderful God-given process where, goods and services that are produced, supply, that's the supply side, continually adjust to exactly where and match the goods and services that are wanted by society, the demand. It's a wonderful system. And for each period of time, by free choices of every individual or store, rather than the government. Look, no government agency was needed to tell the delivery trucks how much product to deliver, yet it all gets done without a loaf of bread molding or a carton of milk souring. And see, so what I wanted to clarify is that capitalism is basically a good system. Now, greed is not good. Greed is the root of all evil. But the Bible teaches, as you said, Marshall, that the proper role of government is to punish those who do evil and praise those who do well. So we'll be back in a few minutes, folks, with the story of liberty and our discussion on the economy of America.